There's no place like the Cube.
Family, it's your favorite queer radio personality, Anna DeShawn here, and it is Women's History Month, which means we have got to queer it out. I'm with my homie. You know, we stuck together. We are locked tight. Amanda, what's going on?
It's true. You're stuck with me forever now.
I mean, it just is what it is. And family, I know you are happy to hear that because these videos, yes, this series has been fired. And today we get to talk about another lesbian legend, okay, an icon on the West Coast. And I didn't know who she was. And that's why we're doing this video. Jeanne Córdova is our highlight for today. Amanda, tell the good people, why did you even want to talk about Jeanne?
So I want to talk about Jeanne for a couple of reasons. One, I'm a total Jeanne Córdova fangirl. I love her. She's one of my favorite people in, sort of like queer activism, queer history, but also because she played such a crucial role in the formation of the West Coast LGBT movement after Stonewall. And I think that her contributions were massive, and they just sort of often get overlooked in the story of the activism that followed Stonewall. So I wanted to talk about her.
And a Stonewall that happens in New York City reverberated across the entire country. And Jeanne, over here on the West Coast in California, was doing so much work and encountered so much discrimination and hate. And she bucked the system. And family, I cannot wait for you all to learn more about Jeanne Córdova like I did and will continue to do. Because I feel like every time I talk to Amanda, there's something else amazing about Jeanne that I didn't hear before. So
it's a lot.
It's a lot. She did a lot. And I mean, I think that's the point of this, right? Yeah. She made history over and over and over again. So, Amanda, what if we just start in the beginning?
Let's do it.
Let's do it. Where did she grow up?
So Jeanne Córdova was born July 19th, 1948 in Germany. She is American. Her father was Mexican-American. Her mother was Irish-American, but they were living in Germany at the time. So she spent the first few years of her childhood in Germany.
Didn't see that coming. Okay, yeah. Germany it is. How did she get to Cali?
So she and her family, I think her father was from Los Angeles, and she and her family moved back when she was a kid. She was the second oldest of 12 siblings. So this huge, huge Catholic family, moving back to Los Angeles. And I think she probably learned a lot about how to build community and like communicate with people just from being in that huge, huge family, trying to figure out how to coexist with all of her siblings.
That is a party every day. They celebrating a birthday every other week. I mean, big families, it is always something going on. Never a dull moment.
Yeah, I don't have any siblings, so I cannot imagine what that experience was like.
All right, so she comes from a big family. Got it.
Yeah,
right.
A big, very Catholic family. So when she graduated from high school, she graduated from high school in La Puente, which is a little bit east of the city of Los Angeles, in 1966. And she entered a convent. She entered the Immaculate Heart of Mary convent.
Now, why would a lesbian go and do that?
Well, several things are true. One, she didn't quite know she was a lesbian yet. I'm sure she suspected it, but she didn't quite know yet. Funnily enough, one of the ways she figured out that she was a lesbian was that she slept with the Mother Superior's best friend.
Oh, that's a lovely way.
At the convent.
That is top tier. Okay, way to find out. Wait, so I don't know. I didn't grow up Catholic family.
Me neither.
But I watched Sister Act. So Mother Superior, she was like the head lady.
Boss. Yeah.
She's boss. Okay, so she slept with the boss's best friend?
Yes.
This does not sound like it ends well for you.
Well, so actually, it kind of did. So Immaculate Heart, which is the convent that she joined, was a very, very progressive convent, to the point that she credits the Immaculate Heart with the beginning of her education in social justice and activism, because Immaculate Heart was an organization that was out in all of the communities, all of the poorest communities in Los Angeles. So I think I mean, it was still an issue, don't get me wrong, but I think it probably wasn't as much of an issue at Immaculate Heart as it would have been at a different convent. And Immaculate Heart was actually so progressive that in 1967, they got into a huge conflict with the very, very conservative Archbishop of the Diocese of Los Angeles. And that resulted in 315 of the 380 nuns at Immaculate Heart being granted dispensation from their vows. They quit the Catholic Church, essentially. It was the largest exodus from Roman Catholic religious life in recent history.
That's like 85-90% of the whole convent.
Yeah. And so
Wow.
Jeanne had left the convent at that point. She left sort of right when that fight was ramping up. But you can understand the kind of women she would have been in community with there, were definitely are the roots of her activism and her desire for social justice. So she left the convent and decided, A, that she was a lesbian, so convent life, probably not for her. But B, that she wanted to go to college to study social work.
It seems to all make sense. And it also makes sense why she would join that particular convent.
Yeah.
Okay. I see you, Jeanne.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, she made a very specific choice. So even as a nun, if she had stayed as a nun, she would have been like a radical, social justice nun, as opposed to a, praying quietly in a church nun. So I don't know.
Out in the streets she out in the streets doing good type of
Yeah,
nun.
I don't mean any disrespect to nuns. I know that there are a lot who work in communities. Immaculate Heart was a very specific group of women.
I mean, and the more you tell me about them, the more I feel like this is Sister Act. These are
kind of.
It's the Sister Act convent.
Kind of. I don't know. Maybe Sister Act was inspired by Immaculate Heart. I don't know. It's possible.
Okay, so Jeanne becomes real close with Mother Superior's bestie.
Yeah.
She leaves the convent, clear now that she is a lesbian, but she's also clear she wants to do social justice work.
Yeah, exactly.
And then she's going to school for that.
Yeah, so she went to CSULA and then UCLA. She got both a bachelor's in social welfare and a master's in social work pretty quickly. And then, right around that same time, on October 3rd, 1970, she attended her first meeting of the Daughters of Bilitis.
All right. This also tracks. I mean, this was an organization doing lesbian work. The first one, I believe, they also had a publication called The Ladder, which I've definitely reported on because I've done stories about Lorraine Hansberry, and she penned in The Ladder, not using her name, but it's quite clear she was family based upon the things that she wrote.
Oh yeah, I did a video about Lorraine Hansberry last year.
Yeah, so I'm familiar with the Daughters of Bilitis. Bilitis? How do you say it?
I believe it is Bilitis, but I could be wrong.
Okay.
So she attended her first meeting on October 3rd, 1970, and a couple of months later, she was the president of the Los Angeles chapter.
She was that person.
Yes, she absolutely was. And so unfortunately, what happened is she became disillusioned with the DOB pretty quickly, because as president, she thought it was part of her job. It was indeed part of her job to go out to, meet different groups of people, to talk to different groups of people. And she met for the first time radical lesbian feminists, and they really impacted her understanding of herself, of the world, of the shape of feminism as a whole. And so she very quickly came to believe that the DOB was not radical enough for the kind of work that she wanted to do.
And for me, this feels so much like reality. And that's why it's always good to have more than one. We always need more than one group, because everybody's got to find their spot. Some people are more radical than other people. Not that we all don't want the same things. We just all don't agree on how we get there.
Yeah. And I've had this conversation in so many different contexts recently, because although she got disillusioned with the DOB, and we'll talk about sort of where she went from there, she didn't stop being in community with the members of that group, and they didn't stop working together when it made sense. And that is a thing that I desperately wish people would understand right now, is that you don't all have to have the same end destination in mind to walk together along the journey for a while, right? Like, for example, I am a prison abolitionist. My ultimate goal is that prison never exists. But that doesn't mean that I can't work with someone who just wants to improve the conditions in prisons, because that is on the path to where I want to be eventually, right? Like, so we don't have to work across purposes just because we don't ultimately agree that prison shouldn't exist. Same
Absolutely.
thing.
Absolutely. And yes, all of this. Amanda, we will be here all day talking about this. We will forget we were talking about Jeanne Córdova. Okay. But I will say, I agree. And we all have work to do. We all just have to find the spot where we feel comfortable doing the work.
So she got disillusioned with the DOB pretty quickly, decided she wasn't going to run for another term as president. So instead, she volunteered to take over the newsletter. So they had just sort of like an internal newsletter that nobody really cared about. So Jeanne and a bunch of her friends were like, we'll just do this and someone else can be president and like do all that. We'll just do this thing over here. So they renamed the newsletter as the Lesbian Tide. It was one of, I think, 5 publications ultimately that Jeanne would found over the course of her life. And it was the first publication to use the word lesbian in the title. And the Lesbian Tide very quickly went from being just the DOB newsletter to the newspaper of record for the lesbian feminist decade. So like 1970 to 1980.
I could never underscore just how important media is. I don't care what form it comes in. If you find your people, if you are speaking truth, if you are reporting on things that people care about, you will have a significant impact within that community. And I feel like Jeanne understood that. She was like, y'all don't care about this newsletter.
The Lesbian Tide quickly got a little too radical for the DOB. So Jeanne and a bunch of her, like the other people who were working on the newsletter basically orchestrated it so that the DOB would vote them out so that they could take the Lesbian Tide with them. So they didn't want to quit and like be dramatic, but they orchestrated everything so that the DOB would vote them out and they could take the Tide with them, which is what they did.
Brilliant. Brilliant.
Yeah. At the same time, Jeanne was also the human rights editor of the Los Angeles Free Press. So she was doing a lot of things.
She was a writer. She was doing what she was good at, which I also think is an important part of the movement, right? If we all just do what we are good at, if we all just do what we're called to do, the movement will move forward in such a beautiful way because we're all being in our zone of genius. And the more I learned about Jeanne, I feel like she would be my friend.
Oh God. Can we just so she wrote this memoir that I love. It's literally one of my favorite books. This is her on the cover. Just
she just looks like a badass.
She was. And so this memoir, I love this memoir. We'll put a link to it in the show notes. I think everybody should read it because it is a memoir not only of her time at what was really the cutting edge of second wave feminism and radical feminism in the 70s. And so it's a memoir sort of the movement from the inside, because one of the things, people who are at all familiar with feminist history, which I granted is a group that's about this big, but people who are familiar with feminist history tend to think of second wave feminists as very conservative, very dour, very buttoned up. It just has this reputation for being just a very sort of unsexy, too serious time in feminism. And that may have been true for a large portion of the white feminists. That is not the experience that Jeanne and her comrades were having in the 70s. So this memoir is also the memoir of her very, very chaotic romantic life during this time. Which sometimes you just want to reach into the book and take 24-year-old Jeanne by the shoulders and shake her and be like, what are you doing?
She's like, she would respond by saying, I'm being 24. Okay, I'm out in the streets. Jeanne was hot, so I can imagine.
I would have absolutely been in the line of people waiting for her to ruin my life. I absolutely would have. No shade.
I
But
love that
so
she felt bold enough to write about it all.
yeah, and like in later interviews, talking about the process of writing the memoir, and then of course like speaking to the women that she was in those relationships with about how she was going to write about them and sort of like what she was going to say, and like it is so painfully honest. And I think that's a rare feat for anyone to write that honestly about, especially their younger self who was perhaps making choices their older self would not make. But it's so easy to separate the facts of history from the lived experience of history. And so one of the reasons I really love her memoir is that those two things are absolutely intertwined. Like there is no difference between the movement broadly and Jeanne's life. And part of that is because, and I know you and I both love this because this is a phrase we both use, Jeanne referred to herself as professionally gay. Like that was her full-time devotion in every area of her life. And I know that's the thing both you and I say. I literally say I'm professionally queer on the internet. Like
facts. Me too. Yeah.
And she sort of fundamentally didn't understand people who she thought were only like gay after hours, like when they got home from work. She sort of fundamentally didn't understand people who like, wore suits and went to offices and just sort of like, were like part of the mainstream and then came home, to their same gender spouse or whatever. So she sort of didn't get it. But so it gives a very honest, but very interesting look into the organizing portion of the movement, of which she was also an enormous part, because in addition to being a brilliant journalist, excuse me, and a really sort of like thoughtful writer, she was a very, very good organizer.
That people really respected who she was in the world.
Yeah, and a lot of it, like, she was also just a very good nuts and bolts organizer. Like, pretty much any major event or organization that happened between 1970 and 1980 on the West Coast, and sometimes in places like Chicago, Jeanne was involved. Like, was on the planning committee, was on the board, was founding things, whatever. Partly because she was like a person who was willing to do it. Anyone who's ever tried to organize people knows that there is always a point where a whole bunch of people are sitting in a room looking at each other going, well, someone needs to be in charge.
Yeah. So who gonna do that?
Yeah.
Look at
so
around
she was definitely a person who would do that. And the thing that's also, so this period of time from like 1970 to 75 and then 75 to 80 were almost two completely different times, especially in feminist and LGBT activism. Because from 70 to 75, there was a lot of fire and power that came from the Stonewall riots, that came from the Vietnam War, that came from Nixon being an absolute horrible human. So there was a lot of fire and passion that was driven by all of those things. By 1975, the fire from Stonewall has waned a little bit, at least in like the sort of national consciousness. Nixon is out of office. People are no longer being drafted and sent to Vietnam, like young people. So it really took the wind and the energy out of a lot of activism, because people just weren't like fired up all the time about everything else that was happening in the world. Yeah. And it's really interesting to me that she bridges those two periods, because there was such a sort of marked change in the middle of the 70s.
Which would have made her publications even more important. More critical.
And the conferences and stuff she was organizing. So she was involved in the 1971 West Coast Lesbian Conference.
Cool.
And that is the one, if you have ever heard anything about that conference, that is the one where a group of lesbian separatists called the Gutter Dykes protested a trans folk singer named Beth Elliott. So on one day they showed up and handed out a bunch of flyers about, the same ones you see now about Beth Elliott's a man and doesn't belong in lesbian spaces and blah, blah, blah. But on the second day, the day that Beth Elliott was supposed to perform, the Gutter Dykes rushed the stage.
They did what,
And
say?
Jeanne Córdova is one of the people who jumped up on the stage to defend Beth Elliott because she was one of the organizers of the conference. And then she is also one of the ones who, once they got everybody settled down, put it to the 1,300 attendees of the conference to vote about whether or not Beth should stay specifically, but sort of broadly, how they felt about trans women in their lesbian space.
I have so many thoughts, but what happened when Jeanne put this up to a vote? Which seems odd, but she put it up for a vote.
Well,
okay.
I mean, yeah, but I can also see how in the moment, like, what else are you going to do, right? You've got like 1,300 people, a group of angry dykes, self-identified dykes. Like I can kind of see how she and the other organizers were like, all right, well, we're going to vote and we're going to see what everyone thinks. And so Beth Elliott won the vote, and it's a little unclear by how much. Some reports say that she overwhelmingly won, that like an overwhelming number of the attendees voted for her to be able to perform and to stay at the conference. Some sources say that she only won by a little bit, but everyone is in agreement that the majority, whether a small one or a large one, of the attendees believed that Beth should perform and that trans women belonged in lesbian spaces.
Well, that's refreshing, because
I know, thank God.
That is not always the case.
And this is, people get so mad at me when I say that TERF ideology started in the American lesbian feminist movement, but it did. And I say that not like, because unfortunately when I say that, people are like, are you saying all lesbians are TERFs? No, obviously not. Most lesbians are not TERFs. But this specific political ideology grew out of the radical feminist lesbian separatist movement in the 1970s. And like, this was one of the first incarnations of it.
I also want to say, and get back to Jeanne, that every identity has the right to have their own sacred spaces. But Chile, you ought not ever discriminate against somebody else in your community ever. Trans women are women. And the idea that women who are looking for their own liberation would then treat somebody in their community the way other people treat them, bum rushing a stage, it just breaks my heart, and it makes me angry all at the same time.
And Jeanne Córdova had a very, very nuanced view of gender and fluidity that only got sort of more nuanced as she got older. Because Jeanne Córdova self-identified as a butch Chicana lesbian. She also self-identified as a gender non-conforming lesbian. And the first time she sort of had to confront her ideas of herself was the first time she met radical feminist lesbians, because they, as a whole, rejected the butch femme dynamic. They thought that it was painfully heteronormative and regressive, and that to identify as a butch or a femme was to bring the movement down, essentially. And Jeanne's butch identity was something that she had sort of worked to claim, and then dialed down a little bit, by her own description, once she came to work with these radical feminists, and it always kind of like grated at her a little bit, like it didn't feel quite right, but she hadn't really had enough time to sort of think through why it wasn't. And so she very early on in the movement said that there was a distinction between the experiences of people who were born and raised as women and the people who came to be women later in life. But she was unequivocal that both of those people are women. They just have different origin stories, essentially. And that was no conflict or confusion for her. And she sort of didn't know why other people didn't see it that way. Right.
I'm with Jeanne on this. I don't understand.
Yeah. And that's the term intersection hadn't really been invented yet, but that is the intersectionality of the experience of being a woman, the experience of being a lesbian, you and I have very different origin stories, but we are still in the same sapphic community.
Absolutely. So Jeanne is out here, and it sounds like she did a lot. Amanda, what in the world was Jeanne busy doing?
Get a pen. Like the list of things that she was involved in organizing that are in history books is like the 1973 National Lesbian Conference, the 1978 National Lesbian Feminist Organization. She was a delegate to the National Gay and Lesbian Caucus at the 1980 Democratic National Convention. She was deeply involved in the organizing against Prop 64 in California, which was a 1986 ballot proposition that sort of complicated, but essentially would have like forced everyone with AIDS to be quarantined, sort of like lepers. So she was instrumental in getting that defeated. It was defeated. She founded or was one of the founding members of the Stonewall Democratic Club, the Los Angeles Gay and Lesbian Press Association. So she was sort of everywhere all the time. She also at this time was working with, so she had this mentor named Morris Knight. Morris Knight is the founder of the Los Angeles Gay Community Services Center. And Jeanne really credits Knight with teaching her a lot of what she knew about local, like community building, like organizing and providing services on the local level. And the Gay Community Services Center got a federal grant of some sort that was specifically intended to go towards providing, I can't remember what kind, but some kind of service to women. So Morris Knight and his business partner had to hire a bunch of women. So they hired Jeanne and a bunch of her friends. And very shortly thereafter, fired all of them. And what Morris Knight said to them was, GCSC is about gay liberation. I can see in retrospect that we shouldn't have hired you feminists in the first place.
Oh, okay. So here we go.
And this is a very small example of what was a much larger problem in queer activism in the 70s, which was the split between gay men and lesbians. Because gay men's sexism was intractable. And at some point, lesbian organizers were just like, you know what? This is untenable. You are never going to fight with us for what we need as women, what we need as lesbians. So we're just going to do our own thing. It took until the AIDS crisis for the sort of like lesbian half of queer activism and the gay half of queer activism to unite again.
And for good reason. And this was also a time after the AIDS crisis when the L was then placed before the G, right?
Yes, that's right. So lesbian women were the ones, and I just want to preface this by saying lesbians were absolutely affected by AIDS, and we will never know to what degree, because all of the metrics for measuring AIDS impact were based on how men responded to and died from the disease, and the way in which women, the way in which HIV and AIDS progress in women is very different from how it progresses in men. So we will never know how many lesbians and other queer women were impacted, but statistically they were the least impacted group. So it was lesbians who rose up to care for gay men who had been abandoned most times by both their families and the government. So it was lesbian doctors and nurses who were on the front lines. It was lesbian lawyers who were fighting in courts for rights. It was lesbian organizers who were making sure that AIDS patients were fed and could get to their medical appointments. So after the worst part of the crisis had passed, we swapped how we say the letters in the acronym from GLBT to LGBT, both to recognize the role that lesbians had in the AIDS crisis, and also to remind gay men that they are not the front and the first and the beginning and the end of everything.
Period. There's some history within some more history. Okay. I love it. I love when that happens.
It's a whole thing. But meanwhile, Jeanne, in 1981, having done all of this enormous amount of organizing through the 70s, she founded something called the Community Yellow Pages, which was an LGBT business directory. And it was published from 1981 to 1999. I had copies of this.
For real?
Because I moved to Los Angeles in 1995. And this was, distributed pretty broadly. So I had copies of this before they stopped printing it.
That's dope.
It's really cool. I wish I had any of them. I wish I'd known how special it was at the time. I didn't. I just thought it was cool. But this marked a huge turning point in Jeanne's life because she got enormously wealthy off of the community Yellow Pages. It was the nation's largest LGBT business directory. And she made tons of, like, millions of dollars on this. And which fundamentally changed kind of who she was in the world and how she moved through the world. She's wrote quite a few pieces about how, how people become less radical over time and how that's just sort of like the natural flow of things. And that's why we need a sort of constant influx of young radicals, to make sure that we all still keep moving forward. Because she was still, definitely by 2025 standards, was still way radical, but less so than she had been in her youth, because she had money that she could use in different ways. She could spend more time like on boards and stuff. So it's interesting to see her evaluate her change from, hard scrabble, super radical activist to millionaire.
100%. And it's just like how we can have different organizations who believe different roads, get us to the same place. It's the same thing when it comes to this generational situation. As you get older, child, my back hurt. Okay. My knees just can't. How far are we walking? There's so many other
I can't kneel on marble floors in capitals anymore. I can't. It's just not.
You understand? How long are we going? Is there a bathroom nearby? There's just other concerns as you get older. Then we got to begin to adjust how we show up in the movement. And it's not because we are maybe less radical in our ideology. Child, the body just different. The body just shows up different. And so I can hear what Jeanne is saying in this moment, not just because of the wealth that she was able to gain, which absolutely will cause you to move differently in the world.
Yeah, 100%.
But also, chilling just because of Father Time. It just don't treat you right.
It's true. It's very true. She married her wife, who's a woman named Lynn Ballin, in 1995. Interestingly, Lynn Ballin is the daughter of a South African anti-apartheid activist. So they shared a lot of the same worldviews, Lynn and Jeanne.
I can't imagine Jeanne being with anybody who wouldn't.
Yeah, no. Especially because she's professionally gay.
You know what I mean? It would not have worked out.
But yeah, she sold the community Yellow Pages in 1999, and then she and Lynn went to live in Mexico for like 8 or 9 years. And of course, while they were there, they founded a nonprofit centered on economic justice. Of course they did. Of course.
Because we just can't sit in Mexico and do nothing.
No.
We have to organize.
Yeah, exactly. And then they came back to LA in like 2007, I think. And she and her wife created the lesbian legacy wall at the One Archives, which is really cool. And they also co-founded something called the Lesbian Exploratorium, which I believe was like an incubator for like, sort of lesbian and feminist work. So they were busy. And of course, she's still like, still writing, all the way through all of this. And then in 2010, she chaired the Butch Voices Los Angeles conference. And I'm going to see if I can find a link to it. But she wrote this piece about her experience at the Butch Voices conference. And at this point, she's in her, I have to math. She's in her 60s at this point. And she just had this like revelatory experience where she said that she met so many different kinds of butches, like so many different gender expressions. And like she learned so much about the butch community. And this is a woman who's been a self-identified butch for 50 years at this point.
Right.
And she talked about how she and a bunch of, other like older activists and butch lesbians got together and sat down and had this really honest conversation about all of the changes to how people are claiming and understanding their gender, and and basically sat down and like worked through the parts where they were getting stuck on stuff, you know, and like just what an amazing thing to do, as opposed to just like, I have definitely talked on my channel about some lesbian activists from this time who are now kind of like hateful people who have just doubled down and been like, look, I fought for your rights, so like just shut up and be grateful. And like that is not Jeanne Córdova's way at all. Like they sat down and had this like hard, honest conversation about like, what if this is us? You know, what if this is that? Like I just love it.
I love that. And I love the idea of it being maybe this intergenerational space.
Yeah.
Where you're saying she's 60. I'm sure there were younger people in the room. And it is in those spaces where I get really filled up to hear what people who are older than me went through, and to learn how they survived, and to learn what their fight was like. You know, I've never gone into a bar and feared that it was going to be raided. I don't have that experience, but I can talk with other people who have, and that's what fueled their activism, this fight, right? That this attack that they were under. And now I'm part of a generation that hasn't had to deal with that, right? Because of them. Yet. I know. I know. But I mean, I think Jeanne was
Bringing
just
the vibe
probably
down.
What'd you say?
I said I'm bringing the vibe down. I'm sorry.
Oh no, it's reality, right? I mean, truthfully, but I think that's so cool, and I think it's cool that she was still down to learn and listen.
Yeah,
You know,
Yeah.
that's cool.
I feel like if I was like 25 and met 25-year-old Jeanne Córdova, I would have let her ruin my life. But I feel if I met her now, when I'm 47, like when she was in her 60s, I just would have wanted to just absorb like her curiosity and her willingness to, you know, think broadly about things and like look at the world broadly. You know, and then like the next year after that, 2011, is when she wrote her memoir.
She wrote another memoir.
No, that's the one we talked about earlier, When We Were Outlaws.
Oh, she wrote that in 2011.
Yeah, she wrote it in 2011.
Okay.
And it's just, I just love it. I just love it so much.
You're gonna make me read this book. That's what.
Oh my gosh, you have to. Okay. You have to. It's so good. I love it so much. And it's also like, it's pretty sexy. Not gonna lie. Like she's like gets in there about her relationships.
Okay. All right.
And how that went. Yeah, and it's just so Jeanne Córdova died in 2016 of cancer, because cancer sucks.
Yes, it does.
And just looking at the span of her life, right? Growing up in Germany and then Los Angeles in the 50s in this huge Catholic family, having her father literally physically throw her and a girlfriend out of his house when she was like 19, and to the point that like almost broke her girlfriend's kneecap. That experience was so violent.
Wow.
Spending time in this convent, becoming a leading figure in what we now think of as the West Coast LGBT movement, and then just sort of continuing to learn, to grow, to write. Like it just the scope of her life is really, it's just really singular.
It seems like she always had a North Star, and that she was always committed to helping those who she felt like needed the most help. And it seems like from a very early age that was just in her, and it just manifested as she learned more about who she was, and she just kept showing up and just kept writing and kept telling stories, and it just kept working. And then she finds something like the queer yellow pages, and becomes the largest business director for LGBTQ folks. And I think about it today, and I think about the chambers of commerce that exist today, right? In cities across this country. And I'm thinking about, Jeanne Córdova had started this, you know what I mean?
Yeah.
And made a living being of service. I think it's what we would call, and what I define myself as a social entrepreneur. We can be in business and do good all at the same time. It feels like that's who she was.
Yeah, and she really enjoyed it, right? Like especially in the 70s. Like, one of my favorite quotes from her is, being an activist leader brought dozens of women to my bed. Power seemed to attract people, and my political life put me at the center of the action. Like, she really enjoyed it too, you know?
Jeanne was living her best life.
Yeah, I love that.
And I also love that she found love. So
Yeah.
often, organizers, movement builders, it can really take over your entire life. That becomes your partner. That becomes the person, that thing you spend the most time with. So the fact that she was through it all the ladies coming in and out, that she did eventually find love in her life as well.
Yeah, she did. And she and Lynn were together until she died, you know, and Lynn is still, as far as I can tell, deeply involved in maintaining Jeanne's legacy. So
I love that. Man, I love this. And this is why we wanted to do this series, Amanda, because you know all these people. I love history, and we wanted to tell all of you about these amazing queer women so that their stories would never be lost. You can't say you never heard about them, because we're here telling these stories.
Yeah, I mean, it's literally my life's work, so I will take every opportunity to do it.
Absolutely, and we are glad you're doing it. Okay, now family, you know about Jeanne Córdova now, yes? And next week, we're going to come to you with Bobby Lee Bennett. And I bet you don't know who that is. But you're going to find out right here, because we are Queer History Done Right.